My name is Beatrice Lindstrom, and I'm a staff attorney at the Institute for Justice and Democracy in Haiti. I remember being in the office at the BAI when some of our grassroots partners came running through the door and said, have you heard? Basically, there were reports on the radio that people were showing up at hospitals and medical centers with profuse vomiting and diarrhea. Some of them were on the brink of death at the hospital doors. And what everyone was saying was how suddenly these symptoms had hit. And everything about it was the telltale signs of cholera. But because there hadn't been cholera before, nobody was sure. I think everyone feared the worst, but we didn't know yet exactly that it was cholera. And almost as quickly as we began to learn that people in the Central Plateau and Haiti were dying from this unidentified disease, people were also saying that this diarrheal illness had started near UN base in the small town of May. And so pretty early from the beginning, we both learned immediately of the explosive spread of cholera, but also of some of the evidence that eventually turned to link the cholera epidemic to this UN peacekeeping base. The UN itself and public health experts and people who were responding to the humanitarian disaster were saying, we have to be careful with waterborne disease, that if a bacteria is introduced right now, people don't have the means to protect themselves from that kind of disease exposure. People didn't have access to clean water, they didn't have access to toilets, and so the environment was one that was very prone to the spread of disease. But despite those warnings, the UN didn't take the necessary precautions to prevent the introduction of cholera to Haiti. A huge percentage of the population, especially in rural areas, they rely on raw water sources. So that means that they get their water directly from rivers and streams and sources of water that haven't been treated. For example, the Artibonite River, where cholera first started, is Haiti's central river, and it runs throughout the center of the country. And tens of thousands of people rely on the Artibonite River as a source of drinking water. They rely on it for bathing water, for irrigation, for washing. And so when cholera struck and when the bacteria was introduced into the Artibonite River, it infected thousands of people in one sweep. There's a misconception that the peacekeepers that introduced cholera to Haiti were there in an emergency setting and were deployed to respond to an emergency under very urgent circumstances. That's actually not true. The UN Stabilization Mission in Haiti has been there since 2004, and they deploy troops in a 6-month cycle. So every 6 months, there's a new battalion of peacekeepers that are deployed to Haiti. I think the UN should be applauded for having taken quick action in the immediate aftermath of the cholera outbreak to try to respond quickly by working with non-governmental organizations and humanitarian agencies to establish cholera treatment centers and things like that. But having said that, there's also a lot more that has to be done. Cholera still now, 4 years later, continues to kill people every day. And it's a disease that is still not completely under control. And the UN, I think, out of all actors in the world, is the best positioned, even putting aside for a second its moral and legal responsibility to respond to the cholera outbreak. And it hasn't lived up to either its obligations nor its general ability to respond. Well, there's extensive evidence that shows that the UN's negligence and recklessness is the direct cause of Haiti's cholera epidemic. The UN deployed in 2010 peacekeepers from a country that the UN knew to be cholera endemic. They knew that there was an outbreak of cholera in Nepal at the time. Yet they sent peacekeepers to Haiti without taking any measures to ensure that these peacekeepers weren't carrying cholera to Haiti. I think perhaps even more egregiously, they stationed these soldiers on a base that had a horrific sanitation system. There was cracked piping that leaked untreated human waste into a tributary that runs into Haiti's Central River. The waste would collect in septic tanks that would then be emptied into these open-air pits that were basically these large holes in the ground located uphill from the tributary. And so when it rained, those pits would overflow and the waste would run into the river. When the news first broke that there was a lot of evidence pointing to this base, there were independent journalists that went to the base to investigate. And they reported that the smell on the base from this leaking sewage was so severe that they couldn't stand there without covering their mouths and noses. So certainly this was a problem that people should have been aware of and probably were aware of but failed to correct. And that's what gives rise to the UN's legal responsibility for the cholera outbreak. Well, I think it doesn't matter whether the UN was there to do good things or not. In general, our legal system is structured in such a way to ensure that people will be accountable regardless of what the underlying task they were undertaking entails. For example, if an ambulance driver consumed alcohol and ran a red light in a school district and killed a child, we wouldn't not hold that ambulance driver responsible because he was generally in the business of providing emergency medical care. And I think the same duty should apply to the UN. If anything, I think the fact that the UN is this world leader that we look to be a beacon for human rights and rule of law means that it's all the more reason why the UN should live up to those same principles and practice what it preaches and hold itself accountable and ensure that it accepts responsibility and subjects itself to the same rules and laws that it asks everyone else around the world to uphold. Well, there's three things that we have been pushing for. The first is an acceptance of responsibility. The second is investment in water and sanitation infrastructure that will eliminate cholera from Haiti. And the third is compensation for the victims, for the families who have lost loved ones, who have lost wages because they've had to miss work due to cholera. And I think that by undertaking all of those things, the UN would come as close as one could to repairing the situation and repairing the damages that have been caused by their negligence. The UN has agreements with the government of Haiti and with different countries around the world that say that on the one hand, the UN generally will not be sued in national courts. But on the other hand, the UN has promised in return that it will ensure that victims have access to some form of dispute resolution outside of the courts. And so in accordance with that promise, we in 2011 filed claims on behalf of 5,000 families who have been victims of cholera. And we asked the UN to establish what's called a Standing Claims Commission, which is what they've promised that they would put in place so that victims could go and seek justice in this alternative way. We waited for a response from the UN for 15 months. And when they finally got back to us, they sent us essentially a 2-line response that said, these claims are not receivable because they involve a review of policy or politics. That was completely baffling to us, and I think to any international lawyer who has read their response and understands the legal framework in which they operate. Because there's no question that the UN was in fact legally obligated to establish the Standing Claims Commission. It's really important to understand that cholera in Haiti is a man-made disaster. It's something that was fully preventable and something that can be responded to right now. It's something that we can put an end to. And a situation that can be rectified, but we're just choosing not to. And I think if we put ourselves in the perspective of, well, how would we react if this was New York? Hopefully we can also put that same sense of injustice towards Haiti, because I think that there's no reason that Haiti should be treated any differently. And the rights of the people to access justice is exactly the same in Haiti as it would be in New York if the same disaster were to happen here.